Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some San Jose Sharks news, as today was the deadline to tender qualifying offers to your restricted free agents. The Sharks did so with 3 different players, and a few others were let to become unrestricted free agents when free agency opens up tomorrow, July 1st. Now, there were a few players who really were not any sort of surprise expected to go this way. In the case of players like Carl Berglund or Nolan Burke, they were picked up in trades to try to make the contract situation work out. Berglund in the Wallman deal, Burke in the Askarov deal. They were never important and key pieces within the Sharks organization. Then you have a guy like Brandon Coe, who was drafted by San Jose but had very much fallen down the depth charts over these last couple of years. It's not a huge loss to have him go elsewhere. And then, of course, Noah Gregor, who for the second time in a few years, the Sharks are deciding to let become a UFA. I'm sure many Sharks fans are not too disappointed by that, likely actually rather happy that he will not be brought back yet again. But there are a few standout players to talk about here. Let us start off on the qualifying offer side with defenseman Jack Thompson. This is probably the least surprising decision out of the ones that I will be talking about. As that right-handed defenseman, I've just spent the last few days talking about how much the Sharks desperately need some young talent in that position, and as we know, the Sharks did not draft any over these last few days, and so it makes a ton of sense to hang on to Jack Thompson. He's a player who has played a handful of games in the NHL for the San Jose Sharks and has looked okay during that time. It's a player who I think could theoretically become a decent bottom pairing defenseman for the Sharks within the next year or two. It's certainly possible, and it is very much worth it to give him the chance here by keeping his rights and trying to sign him to that new contract. The next player to talk about, definitely a lot more surprising, is Danil Gushchin. It was expected in the case of both Gushchin and Bordeleau, who I will be talking about next, that this past season was kind of the last kick at the can for them, that with them being 2020 draft picks, you were a few years removed from there, and you kind of expect the player to be making a step up into the NHL, and it hasn't quite yet happened. Now, this past season, Gushchin, it looked like it was going to be the case because he had put up a really spectacular preseason that ended up earning him a spot in the Sharks starting lineup for Game 1 against the St. Louis Blues, but it felt as though that the team didn't quite respect Gushchin's start of year performance as much as maybe I did or fans did, because he was placed immediately onto a 4th line, given about 10 minutes of ice time, and when that didn't work out in that first game, he was then healthy scratched for the next 3 outings. So really not given much of the time of day here to truly showcase what he was capable of. Now, after those 3 healthy scratches, he would get put back into the lineup for another 9 games and even got some time spent on the Sharks' second line, but the ice time was still extremely limited, not actually given much of an opportunity here. And so after those 10 games, he would get sent back down, and it became pretty clear that one of the major reasons for why he stuck around as long as he did was because Celebrini got injured in that first game. If not, it's very possible Gushchin would have been sent down a lot earlier than that, and he would remain with the Barracuda for pretty much the rest of the season until right at the end when he got 2 more games up with the Sharks in the NHL. And so it seemed as though that the kind of ship had sailed here when it comes to Danil Gushchin, and that the Sharks would kind of just let him go. And so for him to be getting this qualifying offer, definitely a little bit of surprise, which maybe leans you in 2 different directions here. The first of which is perhaps the Sharks believe that Gushchin still has some level of trade value, and so if they let him walk away and become a UFA, they will not be able to get any sort of assets back here. But the thing is just how much trade value could Danil Gushchin really have? I doubt the Sharks will be able to even recoup the 3rd round pick that they used to take him a few years ago in 2020. Maybe they could get like a 4th or a 5th round pick if a team is really all that interested in picking him up, or perhaps it could end up being like a minor league player for minor league player type of swap. We saw the Sharks do that with Ozzy Weisblatt this past season when they traded him to the Nashville Predators organization for Igor Afanasyev. Something like that could occur as well here with Gushchin. Maybe pick up a 23, 24-year-old defenseman who has struggled to really find any sort of footing in the NHL, and that would be a little bit of a better position for the Sharks to actually try to get them to work out in the big leagues here. that's one direction you could look at, or perhaps the Sharks do still have some level of confidence that Danil Gushchin could become a decent NHL player. But it's hard to imagine. As I said, he wasn't exactly given much of the time of day this past year. And also, as we look forward to next season, there's a limited amount of roster spots that you actually have. Only 12 forwards play every single night. And I imagine many of those forwards the Sharks would want to have dedicated to at least some level of veteran talent. Toffoli, Goodrow, Wenberg, Dellandrea, Grundstrom. These are players that you likely expect to be part of the Sharks lineup. Some of them good, some of them not so great, because the Sharks will already have a host of young, talented players taking up key roster positions. Celebrini, Smith, and Eklund are three players who will absolutely be on that opening night roster as long as there are no injuries that occur. Colin Graf might join them as well. That's 4 young players. And then you have to open up the opportunity for potentially Michael Misa to make an NHL debut, this Sharks' second overall pick from a few days ago. Perhaps Igor Chernyshov could get a shot in the NHL. Then you even have guys lower down in the lineup who might be better served for a third or fourth line role, like Cam Lund, who played a few games for the Sharks at the end of last season, Ethan Cardwell, who could be poised to make that jump to the NHL level. So it's hard to see that Gushchin, or by extension Thomas Bordeleau, really has a shot to make it onto this Sharks roster going into next season. So it is indeed a bit of a head scratcher of why both of these players ended up getting this qualifying offer. Now, it should be noted that just because a player's rights were retained here today, it does not mean that they will be back with the Sharks organization for the next season. It just means that the Sharks basically retain their rights and will have the opportunity to sign them to a contract before anybody else could. If another team approaches Gushchin and tries to sign him to a deal, the Sharks will have the chance to match that to keep him within the organization. However, and specifically in the case of Danil Gushchin, this past offseason, there were rumors that he was going to be heading back to the KHL. It did not happen. He obviously remained in North America, as we know, but it is certainly possible that now, based on how that past season went, he will decide to make that choice and head overseas. The Sharks cannot stop him from actually doing that, and so it is certainly possible he won't be back with the Sharks anyway. When it comes to Thomas Bordeleau here, a little bit more complicated. He probably won't be heading over to the KHL, but there's always the opportunity of a different overseas league. But if he remains in North America, it's basically San Jose or bust. He would be just sitting at home doing nothing unless he signs this contract. So perhaps this is a situation here for the Sharks where Mike Grier approaches these two players and says, you need to kind of understand the reality that you're likely more so AHL players, at least for the foreseeable future. And perhaps both of these players will accept that, sign deals, and just play with the Barracuda. And if they do well enough there, maybe then a trade opportunity could open up. They'll get a high enough value to actually be worth it for a different team to take a shot on them. And perhaps their NHL dream could be achieved elsewhere. It's hard to see a world where they actually truly get time here consistently with the Sharks unless they just do miraculous things in the preseason or training camp. And even as we saw with Gushchin this past year, that might not still be enough. Further on, when it comes to Thomas Bordeleau, this was a player who we did see some decent performances from in the NHL. It just wasn't this past year. He only got 1 game in the NHL this season compared to the year before that, where he got 27 and actually looked all pretty good. And so again, it felt as though it was one last kick in the can for Bordeleau. It didn't end up working out, and so it still remains surprising that he is being kept here. When it comes to the players now not given qualifying offers, there are 2 that stand out very clearly above the rest. First of all, we have goaltender Yorgi Romanov. This is definitely an extremely questionable move that makes me believe there maybe is some sort of like behind the scenes reason that I don't know for why this player is not kept around, because he played some games with the Barracuda this past season and even played a few games at the end of the year with the San Jose Sharks. Now, he lost all of them. I won't necessarily say he looked extremely impressive, but at the same time, the Sharks were a terrible team at the end of this past year, so it's hard to really put too much fault onto Yorgi Romanov. It seemed as though it was extremely straightforward, however, what the goaltending situation for the Sharks could be like next season. Askarov will obviously be in the NHL. The Sharks will sign some sort of free agent goaltender. Optimally, you're probably getting someone like Jake Allen, but if that doesn't work out, there's a few other names out there like Ilya Samsonov as well, who could help make up that NHL tandem. And then in the AHL, you just re-signed Carrier a few days ago, so he'll obviously be there. He could have easily been joined by Romanov, and that could have been your duo for the Barracuda this upcoming season. Now, with him becoming a UFA. It is not impossible for the Sharks to still sign him to a contract, but it would be really unlikely at this point. So they do now have to find a different option, even though Romanov seemed like a perfectly good one at that. Perhaps this is the reason for why the Sharks, or at least one of the reasons for why the Sharks decided to go with the goaltender at 30th overall a few days ago at the draft with Ravensbergen. But it's important to remember that he is a CHL player, which means he is beholden to the CHL-NHL agreement. He cannot play in the AHL for this upcoming season. The good news, I guess you could say, is that he is a November birthday, which means he can play in 2 years, but obviously you do need that stopgap for that next season. It seemed as though Romanov was the perfect player for it, and yet he's being left to walk away. So we'll see what the Sharks decide to actually do with their goaltending situation moving into this next season. It's not really like a huge loss. Romanov was relatively older, and so I didn't necessarily think that he was going to ever become like a true starter here, or even probably a backup, or at least not a great backup in the NHL. But it's just kind of an odd move, I would say, all things considered. The final player to talk about here is Nikolai Kovalenko, definitely the biggest name and the biggest surprise on this list. When it comes to Thompson, Gushchin, and Bordeleau, they all get qualifying offers, but they're all borderline NHLers. They played a few games up in the big leagues, but the majority of the time they have spent in the AHL. Kovalenko, on the other hand, this was his first season in the NHL because he spent the start of his career many years in the KHL, but he was pretty much entirely up in the NHL this past season. Not only that, he started the year with the Colorado Avalanche and was a key target of the Mackenzie Blackwood trade back in December. You can kind of go back and forth whether or not the Sharks were mostly looking at that second round pick as the return, or if they were really looking at Kovalenko, but it seems pretty clear that they at least liked Kovalenko enough to make him an important asset, a part of such a trade. And now just 6 months later, he's pretty much being allowed to walk again. This doesn't preclude him signing a new contract with the Sharks, but it makes it extremely, extremely unlikely. I'd say like a 1% chance, maybe not even that Kovalenko ends up getting brought back to San Jose. And this just really feels like some roster mismanagement. We heard some very public frustrations being voiced by Kovalenko at the end of the season, that he felt as though he was not getting the proper ice time here with the Sharks. And I certainly can't blame him. Obviously, coming out publicly and saying that, it's a big no-no in the NHL world, but it certainly makes a ton of sense. It's one thing to be given very limited ice time, or sometimes even a healthy scratch on a team like Colorado, a competitive playoff roster with a ton of talent on the high end. But when you're on a last place team like the San Jose Sharks, and you're Kovalenko and you're sitting on the bench and you're watching players like Goodrow and Dellandrea and Grundstrom and Gregor constantly get lineup spots above you, you're definitely left wondering why that is the case. It kind of reminds me, and this ended up being the opposite situation of a few years ago, when the Sharks made the Timo Meier trade with the New Jersey Devils and brought in, as a big part of that deal, Fabian Zetterlund. And Zetterlund was terrible in the 20 or so games that he played after that trade got made at the end of the season with the Sharks. It did not look remotely good, and yet he played pretty much every single game, and the Sharks still ended up giving him a qualifying offer that offseason. It obviously worked out quite well for the Sharks. Zetterlund looked pretty good and then was traded away for very little this past offseason, but that's not really the point here. The point is that they gave Zetterlund that chance, and it worked out. With Kovalenko, it feels as though there was some pretty heavy mismanagement here. They absolutely could have had him play the vast majority of these games when he was healthy this season, and the Sharks would not have ended up any worse for it, considering you cannot possibly be any worse than the last place team that the Sharks already were this past season. And so it's strange because Mike Grier, over these past few seasons as general manager of the San Jose Sharks, if there's one thing that we have seen from him, is that he is very stingy when it comes to his assets. He does not like losing anything for free. Back at the beginning of the season this past year, the Sharks held on to Giovanni Smith. This was a player who was never going to get any reasonable amount of time in games for the Sharks. This was a player who, if you had put on waivers, there was about a less than 1% chance that he'd actually get picked up by another opposing franchise. And indeed, once he was put on waivers, it did not end up happening. So the Sharks could have easily done that at the beginning of the year and kept up a player like Danil, who I talked about earlier, but instead they held onto him just so that they could retain his rights, because Mike Grier didn't even want to take the small risk of losing him for free. And so to see those types of moves be made, and then to acquire a player as a big part of a key trade made when the Sharks sent Blackwood to the Colorado Avalanche, and then 6 months later, because of some mismanagement coming from the coaching staff, to lose that player entirely, it does feel like a pretty big waste here. Now, in the grand scheme of things, was Kovalenko going to be a huge key portion of this Sharks roster moving forward? Probably not. As I said, the Sharks have a ton of other young talent coming up, and Kovalenko had sort of aged a little bit out of that. I think he's 25, maybe even 26 years of age at this point, so there's not a ton to work with there, but it is a loss that really did not need to end up happening here. But that will do it for this video. At the end of the day, I don't think necessarily that the Sharks got so much substantially better or worse by the news that we heard from this moment. There weren't some key restricted free agents that the Sharks let go or that the Sharks gave qualifying offers to, but definitely pretty surprising news today when it comes to being a San Jose Sharks fan by who the Sharks did and did not hold on to. Class dismissed.